Hello, everyone. I'm Brownfield anchor reporter Rhiannon Branch, and I want to thank you for tuning in for an update on global ag trade implications stemming from the war in Ukraine. Joining me again today is Gregg Doud, Vice President of Global Situational Awareness for Aimpoint Research. Gregg also served as Chief Ag Negotiator for the U.S. Trade Representative under the Trump administration. And Gregg and I actually had a couple of conversations shortly after the initial attacks in Ukraine, but a lot has unfolded since late February. I can't believe that was 2 months ago. And the war continues. So I guess let's just start with a general update of some of the items that you continue to follow regarding this situation, Gregg.
Well, there has been a lot happen in the last 2 months, and as people know, Russia, Putin's army started up north and hasn't been successful. So now he's been working down south in the southeastern corridor there, trying to connect Russia and head towards Odessa, where the major grain exporting ports are down in southern Ukraine in the Black Sea region. And there looks like some sort of standoff now down there in the south. And what's interesting from a grain export component to all this, there hasn't been any movement out of Ukraine on grain at all at this time, with one exception. There was one vessel of corn loaded here. My understanding was that was what was in the elevator here in the last week or so, and there isn't any other grain moving into the region. So I think that was a one-off kind of situation. We are seeing Ukraine, it's springtime planting time. Very difficult to get an assessment right now on how successful they are getting planted. Most things that I see suggest that they're going to get a half a crop planted, maybe 3/4 of a crop. And so we'll just have to see.
Definitely. Well, when we look at the grain side, when we spoke a couple of months ago, wheat, corn, and vegetable oil were kind of those top three items that you were looking at. Any updates that you want to touch on in terms of those three commodities?
Well, I think on the wheat side of the equation, Russia continues to export. They've sent a lot of wheat to Turkey through the Black Sea there, sent some wheat to Russia and a few other places here and there. Again, nothing coming out of the Ukraine. But I think the latest big development here on wheat that has sent prices higher recently is the extremely high temperatures in India, and the fact that USDA, and I think rightfully so, it had kind of indicated that India might increase their wheat exports from, say, 2.5 to up to about 8 million tons. But recently, India said that's not going to happen. And so that changes the wheat balance sheet and equation pretty significantly. I think the other really important point I'd like to make on wheat is the example that I've been using with a lot of clients is Kenya. And we began to develop a relationship with Kenya here in the last few years because we were talking about doing a free trade agreement with them. Kenya is a very interesting country because they're they import a lot of wheat and they grow a lot of wheat. But if you see what's happening in Kenya right now, wheat is 50% higher than it was a year ago. So it's much more expensive to import for that country. But also because of the cost of inputs and the cost of fertilizer and the access to these inputs and fertilizer, Kenya also expects to grow far less in terms of domestic production. So these countries in Africa and a lot of other countries around the world, Bangladesh, Yemen, et cetera, this is really going to hit them hard, both from the higher cost standpoint of wheat, but also in terms of definitely lower domestic production as well. And I think that's one of the implications we're beginning to see emerge now that we didn't think about a couple months ago.
I want to talk a little bit about vegetable oils because that was one we maybe didn't think about in the beginning that you kind of touched on, and how that was impacting some of our soybean exports. What does that situation look like at this point?
Well, when you add Russia and the Ukraine together, that's about 13% of all the vegetable oil traded in the world. And one of the things that most people don't realize is we actually trade more sunflower seed oil around the world than we do soybean oil. And a huge component of that sunflower seed oil comes from Russia and the Ukraine. Now, the Russians may be exporting some of that, but the big player is Ukraine. And you've already seen shortages of cooking oil in the European Union and countries in Europe because you can't run the oilseed processing facilities in Ukraine. You can't, logistically, it's hard to get anything out of there, even if you could process it. So that's really cranked up the price of vegetable oil all around the world. And then we've had the knock-on effect here in the last few weeks of Indonesia, at least for the next couple of months, maybe just through June, but nonetheless, Indonesia has announced that they're not going to allow the export of any palm oil. Well, that's also a big deal. And it's the combination of these factors, including that Indonesian announcement that's caused U.S. soybean oil futures to go as high as 90 cents a pound, which is, normal is somewhere around 20 to 30. So this whole situation has had huge implications on the veg oil market all around the world.
Definitely. Last time we spoke a lot about China and their need for corn. You mentioned that, usually about half of Ukraine's corn crop goes to China. And then you just mentioned that Ukraine might only get about half of their crop in the ground this year. So what might that look like? Or is China going to have to source from somewhere else?
Yeah, and you've seen them recently purchase some corn from the United States. It'll be interesting to see the size of the U.S. corn export program to China here, and it'll be interesting to see what Ukraine does. Here's the key thing to kind of think, if you really think longer term about Ukraine a little bit here. A lot of their corn production is up in the northern part of the country, and now that Russia has kind of departed that part of the country, at least for now, at this point, we can think that maybe they can get a little more corn planted up there. But of course, we've seen the notion that some things have been mined up there. And I was actually in Bosnia 20 some years ago when they had a similar situation. And that's really scary. I mean, that makes the notion of getting out there with a tractor and an implement a life or death kind of discussion. And so it's very difficult to see what gets planted. It's very difficult to see what can get transported out of the Ukraine to potentially get exported. I would probably, in rough numbers, say something like 5% of normal. And then the question is, well, if you can grow it and maybe harvest a wheat crop and get it put away in storage somewhere inside the country, what do you do with it? And then when you get into the fall crops here, and your storage is full in Ukraine, then what on earth are you going to do when you begin to harvest corn in the fall?
Definitely a difficult situation that we're looking at over there. When it comes to planting across the world, that's one of those issues we were looking at last time, as well as the drought conditions in South America. And now that planting has somewhat slowly started here in the US, we're kind of dealing with these planting delays here and adding that into the mix. So what does that kind of do for the global planting picture right now?
Yeah, that's the real difficulty of all this is at least so far in the Ukraine and Russia, they've had pretty decent weather. And then you've got the dryness now across North Africa and the really hot weather in India. You've got question marks in South America. And then now on top of it, we have all this great fun going on here in the US as well. There is no lack of uncertainty in the ag commodity business right now. That is for certain.
Well, we can move on here, talk a little bit maybe about the livestock side of things. And a lot of that does kind of stem from what's going on in the grain markets. Any updates on kind of how this entire situation is impacting the livestock industry and meat exports?
Well, I think initially there was some real concern in Europe about having access to livestock feed. And I don't know, how that's all played out there. If you give it enough time, there's feed weed in that part of the world, different things that you can shuffle around. And as we get towards wheat harvest, in Europe here in just really 2 more months. There'll be an opportunity here to reassess the situation. We're watching, the pork situation in China very closely, and you're beginning to see, despite the massive lockdowns, some 25 to 35% of the Chinese economy locked down. You're beginning to see a little bit of a boost in pork prices here in the last week or so for the first time, basically in 6 or 9 months. So that's interesting. And then, of course, here in the United States, the dryness out west continues. The price of hay is extraordinarily high. And that is, to me, one of the biggest factors is when you have hay at $300 a ton, that really restricts your ability to do much. Calves have to go into the feedlot. And I think one of the things we have to think about here in the U.S. from a cattle perspective is we've got record high placements right now, and that's because we put a lot of calves in feedlots because there was no other place to put them. But that also means that we front end loaded this thing a little bit, and as we get later on in the year and early next year, what are we going to have in terms of inventory to put in a feedlot? That's a pretty open question, I think.
Speaking of some of those inputs, we can maybe move along to another hot topic right now and a couple months ago when we spoke, and that's kind of this oil and gasoline market that continues to kind of stay at those higher levels. Is that all still stemming from the invasion in Ukraine?
Well, I do think that's a huge piece of the puzzle. I think you've got a lot of displacement. It's going to be very interesting to see where Putin decides his friends are in terms of where, they can still export some oil. India appears to be taking quite a bit of it. I'm sure China is going to take quite a bit of it here. It'll be interesting to see where all that goes and how the sanctions affect all that. Keep in mind that every single good that we use in the United States has to be transported. And I think in terms of diesel fuel, at least 70% of everything that we do involves diesel fuel in this country. So when you have diesel fuel well in excess of $5 a gallon right now, that's going to have major ramifications for the U.S. economy. And then I think down the road here for U.S. agriculture, one of the most interesting conversations for late this year and into next year is going to be fertilizer.
Definitely. And I want to touch on that next. But before I do, these higher fuel prices have kind of stemmed commodity groups and government to talk more about this energy independence here in the U.S. and what we can do on that front. Any input on that, Gregg, of what can be done here in the U.S. to kind of help improve energy independence in situations like this?
Well, I think we have to, as a country, everybody has to keep talking about that and pressing folks here in Washington to come up with solutions on that topic. And the answer is it isn't one thing. It's going to be a multitude of things that we have to do in this kind of environment to deal with that. I think the same goes for the discussion on fertilizer. I think, and when you talk about fertilizer, you can talk about nitrogen, which we can do a lot of domestically, but it is the phosphorus and the potash that are a much more complex and difficult conversation.
Yeah, last time you mentioned that fertilizer was something you would really be watching long term and suggested people continue to watch long term. Since then, we've talked to several folks who are, looking forward to even the 2023 season and kind of expecting those prices to continue upward or at least not come down any. What kind of updates do you have for us on that fertilizer side and kind of what you're watching?
Well, what I'm seeing here that is important for everybody to understand is Brazil has been making trips to Canada. Even Bolsonaro has gone to Russia to talk to Putin. The Chinese are locking down things with, about 30% or a third of all the phosphate for fertilizer in the world comes out of that part of the world. If they're locked down, if their manufacturing sector isn't running, A lot of that manufacturing to make that fertilizer is done in the Shanghai area. That's locked down. What does that mean for the supply of that? Not just for them, but for the entire world. And then you look at the potash side of the equation as well. Everybody's talking to Canada. Everybody's around the world, whether it's India, China, Brazil, the Europeans, everybody's exercised in this. And so I think the United States industry, farmers, policymakers, everybody involved here, we need to be involved in having those conversations as well as we talk to those countries that supply that to us.
So we've touched on it. Planting is now top of mind for U.S. farmers this point in the year. As they navigate this busy season, what items do they need to keep maybe in the back of their mind or even at the top of their minds in terms of the global trade picture right now?
If you're comfortable, I'm not sure that you're breathing. Let's put it this way, is what I would say. There is a lot of different things that make everybody nervous here in this kind of environment. Not to mention interest rates and what the Fed is doing here. The strength in the U.S. economy, the strength in economies around the world. The Chinese economy is not well. And with those lockdowns, that's going to have major ramifications in terms of Chinese needs going forward. But also we have to keep in mind that we're going to get log jammed and bottled up here again with the supply chain issues. Nothing's coming out of China on the supply chain right now. We're clearing up the backlog in our ports. And then you're going to have a conversation here very, very quick about nothing coming from China. And I think, it's deja vu all over again here for us on some of these supply chain issues, I'm afraid.
You talked about these backlogs and some shutdowns in China. Have we touched on everything that's causing that?
Well, it's just President Xi, the Communist Party of China, continues on this zero tolerance policy for COVID, and they mean it. And what we've seen is even to the point of going out and having a conversation with farmers by themselves out in their fields planting crops in China. And I'll tell you one comment that I've seen is my Chinese counterpart, who is now the governor of Jilin province. I've seen him even say, "Look, we got to let these farmers go out and plant here in China, or we're going to have issues here." And so I think it's really remarkable to me to see what China is doing with these lockdowns and the enormous implications this has for all of us on the planet going forward. There are a lot of moving parts here, in addition to what's going on in the Ukraine and in addition to what's going on with weather.
Definitely. Well, Gregg, we touched on a lot of different items there. Is there anything else that you'd like to mention that I, have forgotten?
Yeah, one thing I would say, will somebody shut the gate that let all the black swans out? We need to make sure that we don't let any more of those out of the pen here at this time, because I think we've had quite enough black swans here for the moment.
Well, I accidentally left the gate open at the farm the other day, but I don't think we had any black swans, so I'm not going to take responsibility for that one. But if I find out who did it, I'll be sure to let you know. All right. Well, I'd like to thank you for your time, Gregg. We really appreciate the insight, and that will wrap up today's conversation on global ag trade implications stemming from the war in Ukraine. For more news on this topic, you can tune into your local Brownfield station or visit us online at brownfieldagnews.com.